Let's get all these 13mm bolts out of the pumpkin. I want this as high as possible. Maybe. Okay. All the gasket maker is still holding the ultra gray that I used. Okay, now it's time to peel this apart, and I might have to lower this to get a screwdriver in there. Hopefully this isn't too messy because I got a shirt on that I like. As of right now, I do not see any obvious damage. Oh, wait a second. Why does this not want to go backwards? That's tight going backwards for some reason. I really don't see any signs of binding. So I wonder if it's in these clutch packs. Okay, so now that I got both the wheels off, the brake calipers off and hung off to the side, I got to remove the axles, and now with that pin out, you can slide the drive shaft in like that. And then it helps to have the drive shaft in just the right place. And it also helps to have a screwdriver. just drop that in there and then do it with the other side. Grab the drive shaft on the outside, push it in a little bit. Drop. This is a messy job. I'll try to get rid of all of this. That looks pretty metallic, I have to say. That's not good. But where's that metal coming from is the question, and that's why we're pulling this diff apart to see if it needs to be entirely fucking rebuilt. Here's another piece of metal. Push pin here that bolts on with the 8 millimeter bolt here is what holds the spider gears in, so you can should be able to just rotate this by hand and get the spider gears out. I don't see any undue wear there or there. Here's one spider gear with the clutch pack. I don't see any metal shearing there. Alright, let's pull apart these clutch packs and see if there's any damage here. Shim. Two geared. One geared, two geared. I think this is another issue. If you can see all those lines in there. Feel them. feel them and see them. And I think it should be flat. Like this side. Okay, I've been doing a bunch of fairly easy stuff. This is my new 8.8 Ford Trac-loc 28 spline Positraction. You'd see the Positraction, I think, normally has these spring-loaded plates in here to put pressure on the spider gears and clutch pack. This is my bearing and seal and shim kit from Yukon Gear and Axle. This product, I believe, is a East Coast Gear Supply product. The bearings I've already pressed on, which is fairly easy, and I don't need to show you how to press on a bearing. But I got that taken care of, those two bearings. These are the races for those bearings, here and here. And those races don't need to be pressed in. They get clamped in with the differential bearing caps. These bearings, this one goes in the front of the pinion or towards the front of the vehicle, and this one actually gets pressed on to the pinion itself. So the last easy part I have to do, or fairly easy, is pressing this bearing onto the pinion itself with the proper spacer. And I should be able to use the original spacer that came on this pinion, which I pulled. This is my 3.27 pinion that I pulled out of the differential, but I don't know if you can see this. I damaged this a little bit pulling it off, pulling the bearing off the pinion, because this sits between the head of the pinion and the bearing that's pressed on there. And this shim is measuring about 22 to 25 thousandths. Apparently, if you use a Ford Racing gear set, which is what I have a 373 Ford Racing gear set, that comes with its own brand new crush washer, which will be used. I'm not reusing this one. My Yukon Gear and Axle kit also came with two different crush washers. And apparently, since it's Ford Racing and not a different manufacturer, you can just use the original shim and don't even need to check your pinion depth. But I want to check the pinion depth just in case. And I have written down somewhere what the pinion depth should be and how to measure it. My Yukon Gear and Axle kit also came with a bunch of shims, and they're all different sizes. I put two shims together, which equate to approximately 22 to 25 thousandths, or about what this is. So I can use that if I can't use this. So, one other thing I wanted to show you is my bearing races. I do have them installed. Didn't feel the need to really elaborate that. I have a bearing install kit that is pretty cheap, pretty affordable, and it worked great with a 5-pound hammer. But those are installed well. I don't know if you can see back here, but this is the front side bearing is back here, and I can see that it's pressed up against the cast differential housing right there. And I can also see that from the other side. If you can see in there. But as you can also see, this has been a pain in the ass for me to install from the front side, everything from the front side, because I didn't even think about this, but my rolling jack here is kind of in the way. So that's been kind of a pain in the ass. But so all the easy things are pretty much done. I just need to make an executive decision about whether to reuse this despite the little bit of damage it has on it, or to use some new ones that are roughly the same size as this. The thing is that I'm a little anxious about this, because once you put these shims on and press the bearing on, that's really the only way you can check the pinion depth. And if the pinion depth isn't correct, you need to take off that bearing, which is probably a destructive process. I didn't really, well, I did, yeah, I did destroy this one. So you almost need a couple extra sets of bearings if you don't know what the pinion, if you don't go this route of just installing the original one with the Ford racing gear set. I suspect that if I either reuse this or use some shims that are roughly the size of this, that my pinion depth will be within spec. And again, I have the spec written down. I have to double check that. But I shouldn't have to change it again. If I do, that would be really annoying. So I need to make an executive decision. What would you do? What would Jesus do? That's the question. I think I have my pinion depth range listed in here. Ford 8.8 MHD mounting, I don't know, 4.415 inches. And the pinion depth is measured from the center line, this center axis of the differential carrier, to the face of the pinion. I don't see a spec for the pinion mounting depth. So just a quick update. I did put the differential in place. This Ford manual I skipped ahead a little bit to check the run out. So what I did is install this 0.265. This is roughly 0.265 that I installed on the left side, and then I put shims in on the right side, and just until it fits snug. Now that's probably not going to be my final fitment because there needs to be some preload, but I did that just to check run out, and my run out was less than 2 thousandths. It's required to be within 3 thousandths. So that's good. I just put the ring gear on. The ring gear, I did use this Loctite 638. I know a lot of people don't use this. I don't know why, but I imagine it adds maybe a few thousandths to the position of the ring gear with respect to the carrier, and that would bring it closer to the pinion. So because that can affect that, I want to follow the rules. So I used the Loctite 638 on this. I put some red Loctite on each one of the nuts, and now I'm going to torque them down to 97 to 102 foot-pounds. And then I'll be ready to install the carrier into the differential case. I already have the pinion in and tightened it down and checked the preload. The preload should be, for new bearings, I have new bearings, the preload should be 16 to 28 pound-inch. And I measured my preload at 22 to 24 pound-inch. So I'm within spec there. The question is, do I have the right pinion depth? Now, I measured my original shim, and I would reuse this if I could, but if you can't tell, it's a little damaged. It got a little damaged when I was removing the bearing. So I don't want to use this, but what I do want to use is a shim or combination of shims that get very close or exact, ideally, to the size of this original shim. So I made a bunch of measurements of my shims. They're roughly, this one's roughly 11 thousandths, 6 thousandths, 9 thousandths, 12 and 13 thousandths. A and B gets very close at roughly 0.02, which is 20 thousandths. I need 22 thousandths. B and D measure 21 thousandths, and in fact, B and E measure 22 thousandths. However, when I stick them together and measure them together, they measure differently. A and B doesn't measure 20 thousandths. They end up measuring 23 thousandths when they're together. Same with B and D, measures about 25 thousandths, and B and E measures, which should be perfect. If you add them, they should be 22 thousandths, but they end up measuring together at about 26. So now I just have to make a choice. And because A and B were between 20 thousandths and 23 thousandths, I think that's going to get me closer to the exact spec than 21 thousandths and 25 thousandths or 22 thousandths and 26 thousandths. I think option 3 would be too big, option 2 would be too big, and option 1 maybe too big. I don't know. We're going to have to find out. And that's part of this process, is figuring out the proper pinion depth. So I, in fact, chose A and B and installed the pinion, tightened it down, got about 22 to 24 inch-pounds of preload. That's good to go. Once I have the ring gear torqued down, that will be good to go, and we can get this installed, and I can use some shims to properly preload the carrier. The carrier bearings should have about 6 pounds per inch, 6 pound-inch of preload, but there's no way to measure it, so you kind of have to guess. Once again, you know, this is where experience comes in with things like this and things like the preload for the carrier bearings. Experience comes into play, and I don't have any experience doing this. This is my first time. So there's going to be a lot of install and removal and install. And I have, of course, when you crush the pinion crush washer, you can't back it off and you can't reuse it. Same with the pinion nut. So I have 2 more of these crush washers. So ultimately I have 3 chances to get this right. So let's get it right. Okay, quick update. I did get the backlash within spec. I have the backlash measured right now at about 9 thousandths. And spec is between 8 and 12 thousandths. So it took me quite a while to get there, but I'm there. So now I'm going to paint this up and see what my tooth pattern looks like. And fingers crossed, it's centered within the toe and the heel of the tooth, and if so, we're good. And I can then, I'll have to pull everything apart again to put a new crush washer on, the pinion seal, and what else? And a new nut. So, but that's, I think, wishful thinking. I think we're going to find that the pattern is towards the heel or towards this side, meaning the pinion is too deep. I think the pinion is a little too deep, or I should say too far into the case, which would mean I think the pinion depth is actually less. Or the pinion depth is too small, meaning I would need more pinion depth, less of a shim to move this pattern to closer to the center of the tooth. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. Let's get some paint and see what this looks like. Okay, I'm gonna get this around to the pinion. Oh, wow. Thank you, Lord. It appears to be fairly centered. It's pretty close to the center. In fact, it appears to be contacting all the way down here and almost all the way to the toe, from about here to here. That looks pretty centered. And this looks pretty centered too. Except that looks a little closer to the toe. So let's take a look at this diagram. So heel is the outside, toe is the inside. Here we go. Looks like the drive side is on the bottom. And on the bottom, I'm a little closer to the toe. But you know what? It looks really quite centered. Actually, If anything, it looks a little like this, which would mean I would need a thinner pinion shim, but that the backlash is correct. And I do agree that the backlash is correct. If anything, this may need a thinner pinion shim, and that's what I assumed. I assumed if anything, it would need a thinner pinion shim. But closer to the heel, and on the bottom it's closer to the toe. But this shows the contact patch only from the heel to about halfway to the toe, or from, and on the driver's side, from halfway to the toe all the way to the toe. So my contact patch looks more like this, which is more centered. You know what? I think I'm going to call that good. I put a little more paint on here to see if I could get a better pattern. I don't think it gets much better than that, guys. You could see it's maybe a little towards the heel, little towards the heel on the top, and that's the coast side. And I believe when you're doing new gears and or new bearings, it's the drive side that's important, more important. And that's the drive side, and that looks great. Okay, we're all done. I even got the axles in and the C-clips on and the pin in and the pin bolt. These are all torqued to 90 to 100 foot-pounds. Ford throws another little caveat in: once you get this fitted, the backlash correct, and the gear pattern looks good, they then tell you to take it all apart and put in another 6,000th shim here and 6,000th shim there to get the proper preload on the carrier bearings. But I put about what I measured to be 5,000ths and 5,000ths in, and it was really tight. And my backlash then went from like 9 to 7, which is out of spec. Spec is 8 to 12. So because it was too tight and my backlash was out of spec, I just took the 0.005, the 5,000th shim out of this side and left it in this side. And so I added a shim, so I added a little preload, and now my backlash is right at 11 thousandths, which is in spec, 8 to 12. So, and then I looked at the gear pattern again, and it looked good again. So it's time to button this up and add some fluid.